Today, my guest on the Michael Steele podcast is none other than Professor Heather Cox Richardson. She is a professor of history at Boston College and an expert on American political and economic history. She is widely read through her Substack newsletter, Letters from an American, which synthesizes history and modern political issues and reaches over 1.2 million subscribers. Heather has a new book out which spoke to my heart. It struck me right in the gut of my understanding and appreciation of not just Republicanism, but Lincoln Republicanism. Her new book, Democracy Awakening: Notes on the State of America, is out now, and we get deeply into the book. In fact, folks, I'd get yourself a nice little Chardonnay or Merlot and sit back and enjoy this one because it'll be worth every moment. Coming up next with Heather Cox Richardson here on the Michael Steele Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Michael Steele Podcast. Well, you guys know me. You know where I stand about democracy and Republicans and conservatism. Well, I have a guest today that actually will, allow me to sort of lie on the couch and vent everything that I feel about those three items. I'm really excited to welcome Heather Cox Richardson, the author of her latest book, Democracy Awakening: Notes on the State of America. It is out now. We're going to get into it. Heather, welcome.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. But I fully expect that we're real heart to heart about things like James Garfield, right?
Well, I think, as a matter of fact, his name came up at breakfast the other morning, and I just...
As it does, right?
As it does. So yes, we will talk about Garfield and in all manners. Of course, I mentioned Garfield to somebody, a number of years ago, and they thought I was talking about the cat. So that's a whole nother piece we'll have to explore. I'm excited about your book. And as I told you before we started, you had me right out of the gate with how you set and framed the conversation. From page 9, it was just straight up, and I was like, yes, this is what it is right here. And you started in the book talking about a seminal moment in political life of Abraham Lincoln, which at the time no one knew it was, but it would proved to be with his Cooper Union speech, and which Lincoln retold the history of the country. But in the context of that, he laid out sort of a conservative, I don't say manifesto, but kind of bona fides around the idea of the founders' opposition to slavery and this new Republican Party that was emerging, and sort of declaring it's going to stand on the side of the enslaved. It's going to stand on the side of individual rights and liberties. I have always fashioned myself as a Lincoln Republican. It has defined me from the very beginning of my political journey. And what defined that for me was this idea of the individual right, the individual liberties that are granted by the Constitution. It wasn't about abortion. It wasn't about tax cuts. It wasn't about extending the railroad system. It was about how, as individuals in this country, we are blessed and we are afforded rights, inalienable rights, that are recognized by the government, we the people. Let's start there. Talk to me about how you fashioned this idea of democracy awakening from that moment.
So I will, but I hope we can pick up later on that concept of individual liberties and how it interfaces with the government, because that, I think, is actually a central problem of American life and history. And it's one that very few people really grapple with. And it's something that I'm grappling with for a new project. But the reason I started where I did with Abraham Lincoln in this book is because of the refrain that you hear again and again that Lincoln was a conservative. And it's something that the people that I would now consider far right radicals who control the Republican Party keep insisting is part of their history so that they keep Abraham Lincoln on their side. And of course, he took this on exactly in the Cooper Union Address, because what had happened was that in the 1850s, the word conservative had really never translated terribly well to the United States, because when Edmund Burke started talking about conservatism and the idea that a government should promote stability by reinforcing, social norms and traditional norms and economic norms, that didn't really translate, and they should try and preserve what was already there, conserve what was already in society. That didn't translate very well to a country that was only then righting itself. So it didn't have a lot of traction in the United States. But the time that people started to use the word conservative was when Northerners started to say they weren't going to pay any attention to the piece of the Compromise of 1850 that required states that were based in human freedom to return enslaved Americans to people who claimed to be their owners in the American South. That was kind of murky about how one made those claims. And so Southerners started to say, well, you people are radicals because you're refusing to accept the law.
Right.
And when this happened, a number of abolitionists said, wait a minute, no, we're conservative because we're preserving the Declaration of Independence. And of course, abolitionists never made up more than about 1% of the American population. But that language seeps into this new Republican Party, and Abraham Lincoln really embraces it in that address where he says, listen, you call us radicals, but you're the ones who are trying to overturn democracy. You're the ones who are trying to spread human enslavement. You're the ones who ultimately are trying to create a nation that is based in human enslavement, not only in the South, but also in the West. And when those two work together in the North as well. So we, those of us who stand on the Declaration of Independence, are truly the conservatives in this country. And therefore, it is those of us who are trying to stop the spread of human enslavement and ultimately to extinguish it, who are the true conservatives. And I just thought the use of that word conservative and the many ways in which it has been both used and abused was a really important place to start this book.
So you go on and you talk about the party of Lincoln have put into practice, quote, their conservative position that the nation must at long last embrace the principles embodied in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and must have equal access to resources to enable them to work hard and rise. That was the same position underpinning the New Deal, and those taking a stand against its business regulation and racial advances in the 1930s were not true American conservatives. They were the same dangerous radicals Lincoln and the Republicans of his era warned against. I would project that forward to today's group of Republican radicals known as MAGA, doing the same thing but on steroids. Do you see it that way? And does this period in the 1930s really inform us a lot more about what we're seeing transpire today?
Yes, with a caveat. That is, today's MAGA Republicans, I think, have gone beyond the attempt to get rid of a government that protects that right to individual liberty that you're talking about, and have instead gone a step beyond destroying that government that FDR started to put in place in 1933 and that we have lived under since, and are trying to replace that with, in fact, quite a strong government that imposes a group of theocratic rules on the rest of us. So we're kind of beyond that. That's where I was, that's where I think we were in 2015, 2016. But the Trump presidency, I think, took those people and welded them into a movement that, in fact, is calling for Christian nationalism, or a form of what somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary calls illiberal democracy, or his version of Christian democracy, which is not the same as the European version of the Christian Democratic parties. So I think we're kind of beyond that into a strong government that opposes its will, really, truly authoritarianism, and not simply a rollback of the government that has protected individual rights since Lincoln.
How do we get it so wrong? I mean, even going back to the time of Lincoln, where he recognized those forces in the country in the form of slavery and those who perpetuated or wanted to perpetuate that system, tying it to the economy, right? Tying it to social status, the position of the Southern white male, for example. Why do we continue to fall back on that? And that seems to entrap so many still to this day. When you stop and think about how destructive it all is, because it is illiberal, it is anti-democratic in the main.
So that is, I think, touching on the central question that people always ask about the MAGA Republicans. Is it about gender and race, or is it about class? Is it about the economy? And I think the answer and the reason it becomes so potent is because it's both. Because in the United States, race especially, and gender is going to get added in the 1970s, race and class are intertwined. And they're intertwined because of our history of human enslavement, and especially because of what happened in the period immediately after the Civil War. And that is, after the Civil War, when the federal government begins to use its power to protect the rights of Black Americans in the South, primarily Black men in the South. At first, as we all know, a number of former Southern Confederates, white reactionaries, begin to try and keep Black Americans from exercising economic rights and social rights, and certainly try to keep them away from the vote after the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, and instead dress up like the ghosts of former Confederate soldiers in white sheets. That's where that came from, and try and terrorize them and keep them away from the polls and threaten their lives. But with the 14th Amendment, which is ratified in 1868, the 15th Amendment, and which says that the federal government, that states can't discriminate against individuals, and that the federal government will stand behind that. And the 15th Amendment, which protects Black voting, all of a sudden the idea of going after your neighbors on the basis of race becomes something that can and does land a number of people in prison. So by 1871, they changed their language, these Southern white reactionaries, and they say, listen, we never had any problem with race. That was never part of the equation here, which is complete crap, by the way. It's all over those documents and what people are saying in speeches and all that. They say our problem is that having a federal government that protects Black rights costs money. And who has money to pay that? White people have money to pay that, because Black people, because of enslavement, don't have any of that money.
Right.
So the idea of having a federal government protect Black rights means essentially, and letting Black people vote, Black men vote, essentially means that you're redistributing wealth from hardworking white people to undeserving Black people. And that equation there that links race and class becomes unbelievably potent, because you can rely on either one of them depending what your audience is. And it's very, very hard to untangle them. And also when people try and call you out and you say, hey, I'm not talking about race, I'm talking about class. Or, hey, I'm not talking about class.
And we see that today. Yeah, we see that in so many forms today. Does that take hold the way it has in a Reconstruction era time, moving into Jim Crow, moving into the Civil Rights era, moving into the era we are in now, where there are fine people on both sides? Does that relate back to the fact that we didn't crush this in its infancy? That as a nation, and I always say that if I had to go back in time, I would go back to the day Abraham Lincoln decided to choose his vice president. Because in so many respects, that made such a difference post the tragic events of April 4th, 1865, when he was assassinated. And we watched all of that pain and growth that was a part of the Civil War that led to the freedom of the Black individual, but established the potency of the words of the Constitution. All of that began to get chipped away at and eaten away at and beaten down, where we were erecting monuments to the very men who were indeed insurrectionists and traitors to the very idea that the founders had put in place. And the fact that we as a nation did not stomp that out of existence before its roots had a chance to take hold and strangle us. That's how I see that post-Reconstruction period to the modern time is that the country just kind of go, well, if we just all just go along to get along. Meanwhile,
yeah. So yes, I mean I thoroughly agree with that. So it's important to remember that Congress is not in session when Lincoln dies. Right. It has disbanded, and so for 9 months, Andrew Johnson is going to be able to run Reconstruction however he wishes, and he's a Southern Democrat. He's not a Republican. They're actually elected on a Union ticket.
Yeah, that's right.
Before, and it also important to remember that essentially by the end of summer 1865, he has pardoned all but about 1,500 Confederates, brought them back into the body politic. And what that means, now that's not the way it's going to ultimately play out, but every presidential pardon stays in place, and though he pardons all the leaders. But what that essentially means is this is the fall of 1865. Congress is going to come back in December of 1865. And what that means is that because of the new census that's going to be held in 1870, white Southern reactionaries are going to have more power after the Civil War than they did before the Civil War. So by doing that, he has already thrown an extraordinary monkey wrench into the body politic. But then at the same time, there is never any penalty for having embraced the Confederacy and cost 600,000 lives and almost $6 billion. Those same people are back in Congress or in Washington, expecting to be seated in Congress by December of 1865 or early in 1866, including Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy. And the legitimation of that ideology that some people are better than others and should rule them, therefore grows. And it moves quite naturally into the American West and has poisoned our politics ever since. It's no accident that the insurrectionists of January 6, 2021, carried a Confederate flag into the U.S. Capitol, which is mind-boggling.
I know.
But that's that same ideology.
Is there a political enema for this? Is there a way we get to clean this out of our system once and for all, or are we perpetually doomed to live in this cycle where there's accommodation with white nationalism, there's accommodation for so-called patriots who at the end of the day are nothing more than racist thugs who are trying to perpetuate an America that never really existed, create this space where white supremacy was always the dominant thing, with the Christo-fascist nationalism that we see arising. Are we just stuck now with this? As a historian, you're looking not so much as much forward as you are backwards, because past is prologue in some respects. But there are trend lines in which we can learn and hopefully do better. Help me find those trend lines.
So one of the things I'm very fond of saying is that the future is unwritten. The future is always unwritten. And one of the things I will tell you, and I don't talk about this a lot, but one of the reasons I do what I do is because I wrote a book about the Wounded Knee Massacre, which the 1890 massacre in which a band of Lakota was destroyed by the U.S. Army. And in that, the outcome had already happened. And I followed every little piece of it, and I couldn't stop it. And that was incredibly hard. If anybody follows me, they will know that always on the anniversary, I write about it and what that meant and how it was there was still time on the night of December 29th, 1890 to stop it. But nobody did. We can stop what happens tomorrow. We just have to have the will to do that. And then for all the horrible things that happen, we have also stopped horrible things and made great things happen. So we can, in fact, change the future. So that's the baseline. But how we change that future, one of the things that really jumps out about what we were just saying is that there were never any penalties for launching an insurrection against the United States government. And in fact, indeed, because of the cultural changes and the cultural embrace of that ideology, we got the statues to former Confederates and we got all those things that we could talk about. But one of the things that jumps out to me right now is the Department of Justice's prosecution of more than 1,000 people who participated in that insurrection of January 6, 2021, and the cases that are going forward against some of the ringleaders of that. Not all the ringleaders yet, I'd like to put out, but some of them. And one of the things that does is it creates a cost to taking a stand against the United States government. And, people say to me, the MAGAs, they're going to take over again. And I think, well, there was a history on January 6th that said that you could take up arms against the United States government and nothing was going to happen, that you were going to get lionized in right-wing media and you were going to swagger home.
We did it after the Civil War. Exactly. So you can see the history all written right before you.
Well, but not just then. You can you think about the Bundys and everything that they had done, the right-wing militias, and the increasingly open carry of weaponry and the threats against people. Certainly during the Trump administration, the things that people did against Gretchen Whitmer, for example, and there was really not a lot of pushback against that. Now that you could go to jail or to prison for 8 years, 10 years. That changes the equation, I think. And that's one of the ways that you stop it from happening again. And another way you stop it from happening again is people like you and me talking about democracy and about the fact that a multicultural democracy is better economically for everybody. It's better socially for everybody. It's better culturally for everybody. And we insist on maintaining our majority against that 20 to 30% of people who will always retain an allegiance to reactionary politics.
Is that why, not exclusively, but certainly in an important way, why you're in your book, Democracy Awakening, you return back to Lincoln. No matter the period you're in, you return back to Lincoln, which again, as someone who just has this particular affinity for the man and his flaws and all the things that made him complicated, but then not so much, just who he was, you return back to him. Why do you do that? What was so profoundly important that you wanted to, at various points, remind people of this Lincoln-esque value, this Lincoln-esque proposition, idea, policy, point of view?
So Lincoln was a genius, and you need to start there with that. And people who know him really well see the growth under which he developed his ideas, the things he weighed. He was a deeply flawed man, all the things you say. He understood things at a very deep level, not only ideas and events, but also people. But at the end of the day, he strips it down to what it's really about. There are two ways to look at the world. There is the idea that some people are better than others and have the right and maybe the duty to rule everybody else. And usually that leads quite naturally to the idea that one person is better than everybody else. And this is how we get dictators and authoritarians.
And which is what they're trying to do with Trump right now.
And on the other hand, you have people who say, no, we're all created equal and we should have a right to be treated equally before the law and have a say in our government. At the end of the day, that's really what it comes down to. And of course, Lincoln couldn't see that women should be included, and he had a really complicated relationship with Indigenous Americans and with Chinese Americans and with Mexican Americans. Those were also all in the hopper in the 1860s, although we don't talk a lot about that. But at the end of the day, he managed to boil it down in terms that everybody could understand. And, the fact that he managed to turn a group of white men against the idea that they should run everything was a stroke of genius, in part by saying, listen, today it's them, tomorrow it's you. And that, I think, is a message that is starting to spread across the United States today, and is the reason that I think we're building a movement to say we don't want MAGA Republicans running our lives.
Well, I'm so glad you put it that way, because I have to tell you honestly, it's so refreshing speaking with you, Heather, because a lot of times, for someone like me who, as I said recently in a speech, I became a Republican by choice. It was the least popular thing I could possibly do politically growing up in Washington, D.C. as a young Black man. All right. I mean, if you talk about having your head examined moment, that would be the one where I go to my mom and say, hey, Mom, I think I'm going to join the Republican Party. And she looks at me and say, well, you're not getting dinner tonight. Right. Is that
tomorrow
or tonight, tomorrow, or any day. Right. It is that kind of moment. But what you just said is so important and so true that we find ourselves locked into this situation, and you realize we don't have to be here. That there are many ways in which we've already been given the key to let ourselves out of the room.
Absolutely. That's a really great way to put it, because the other corollary to that Lincoln talks about is the government, the way that it was operating before the Republican Party rose, was that it really was protecting property in such a way that it concentrated wealth and among a very small group of the American people who were the large enslavers in the American South, and they took over the political system, and they fully expected to take over the nation and to spread their ideology across the globe. And they're really articulate about this. So Lincoln looks at that and he says, it's not what the founders wanted. It's not what the framers wanted. It's certainly not what they did when they put in place the Northwest Ordinance, which said, we're not going to have primogeniture in the country north of the Ohio River. That means that the rich people don't leave everything they own to their oldest son. It's going to have to be spread evenly, and or just not go by primogeniture. And we're not going to have human enslavement because that concentrates wealth. So if the government is trending toward the idea of protecting democracy as early as that, right, in the era of the framers, what does that mean for governance? And what he says is the government should do for a community what individuals cannot do for themselves. And so you want to have a government that's of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that's just earth-shattering. I mean, for all that Jackson talked about it, and that's why I was saying I'd like to talk to you about the relationship between the government and liberty, because that's something Jackson does not resolve. That's something that Lincoln does resolve and comes up with an ideology about how that works. And that, isn't that what we're arguing about right now today?
Absolutely. So let's just go there. Let's get into that, this idea of government and liberty, and how that works and how it's playing itself out. Floor is yours.
Where do you want to start? Well, actually,
any place you want to start, because in one sense, I think, Heather, it's not complicated, at least from my looking at it. And the reason is for me because I rest that idea that these two notions are not at odds with each other, government and liberty, for the simple reason that our founders wrote the most important words ever in a governing document. We the people. Not we the government, not we the Department of Health, not we the president, not we the Congress. We the people. We are ultimately the government. So by definition, we are the arbiters of our liberty. But
stop right there.
I'll stop right there.
Because this is what keeps me up at night. We the people, great. At what level? At the state or the federal government? Because from Jackson onward, Andrew Jackson, when he begins to articulate this in 1820, in the late 1820s, if he takes a stand against the federal government the way that he does, because he's trying to protect the power of the Southern planters like himself, and to some degree the way that Martin Van Buren is trying to do in New York in order to protect his own power there, he says is that true democracy is at the state level, because that's what the people really want, and not at the federal level, which is starting to to intrude on my rights. So it's all at the state level. But the problem with that idea is that, and that of course, the idea that we need to focus on the states is what's behind originalism in the late 20th century. The idea that we take everything back to the states. But by the same token, it's the states that get to decide who votes. So if you had actually had democracy at the state level in the 1850s, how many enslaved people were going to vote for slavery?
Right.
So that whole idea of
in Ron DeSantis's world, they probably would, because there's a great jobs program. I mean,
yeah, I've heard, right. And don't even start me on women, but So, how do you both embrace the idea that democracy belongs at the state level, the way modern day originalists do, and recognize that it is at the state level that we have the destruction of personal liberties? And this, of course, why we get the 14th Amendment in 1868 saying, no, 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 we don't trust the states because the states are screwing people over right and left. The federal government's got to step in and make sure that people are treated equally before the law and have the right to due process before the law. And then, of course, we've flipped the other way, in which now we're throwing things like theoretically abortion rights, although that's not the way it's playing out, and so many rights back to the states. It seems to me there is a central contradiction there between liberty and the power of the government, as in, are you talking the state government or the federal government? And how does that play out? And somebody said to me the other day, well, that's the whole point. There's not supposed to be a solution. You're supposed to fight between the two.
That's what I was about to say.
But okay, but then what do you do in a moment like this when the states are, look at what's just happened in North Carolina, where that newly gerrymandered district map basically has created a one-party state.
But looks also what happened when we, the people, as a nation, not individual states, decided that A, Black men and women should be free, B, women should vote, C, that you have protections under the law that are guaranteed, and that the federal government should be the instrument by which that is prosecuted on your behalf. Those are moments that transcend the individual states' rights. The 10th Amendment notwithstanding, there is a moment that our founders understood that would come where we, the people, as a United States, as a confederacy of colonies that become these important institutions for individuals to live their lives and find their freedoms, we would all have to come together around that big moment, that national moment, that crisis, that period where, as a nation, we have to decide who we are, what we believe, what we stand for, and whether or not these things matter, notwithstanding the fact that Mississippi want to keep Black people in chains, notwithstanding the fact that New York want the robber barons to continue to run Wall Street. So that, for me, this idea of we the people, the empowerment of that is not conflicted by what a state wants. It is determined by what we decide as a nation, which is why when I go out and I talk to people and I say about this moment, Heather, we are here with Trumpism and MAGAism because this is where we've decided we want to be. Donald Trump it's at 50% against Joe Biden, and in some polls beating Joe Biden. Why? Because we, the people, have decided that's what we want. And until we decide otherwise, that's how that's going to play out. So you can begin to see, I think, in a way how we elect the president, through this electoral college process, and the states have the final say about certain things that they want to do when it comes to who gets to vote or how they get to vote. But there does come a consensus moment where the country goes, you know what? We're not doing it that way because it's antithetical, it's illiberal, it's anti-democratic. And that's how I kind of put it together.
So I get it, but are you saying then, though, that once the states become completely illiberal, and I'm going to pick on North Carolina again with its new district map,
right?
That essentially we need to have a national movement that operates.
Didn't we before?
Well, we did, but
that's how we got the Voting Rights Act.
Well, yes, but essentially, then I think in a big picture, you're suggesting that we have to have we will have backsliding in the states, and the way we get around that is a national movement at the federal level. But there is a gap between those two things, which is going to mean that a lot of people are going to lose rights for probably a fairly long time,
as they have done, and until the country decides. I mean, and again, this is the thing that we find ourselves having to deal with. I think until the country decides that type of action taken by a state is antithetical to our founding and to the governing principles, ideas of how they want to frame it, yeah, you're going to have states that are going to backslide. You're going to have states that are going to try to cheat the system. It is what I think is self-corrective about what our founders wrote in how they empowered the government, us, to make these decisions ultimately. And that the individuals that we elect are flawed and sometimes careless, but we ultimately are the check on them. They are our avatars. They are an extension of our aspirations and our frustrations. We have politicians who want to prey largely on their frustrations. We have others who are trying to create aspirations to help us move away from those frustrations. But that's the battle of this country, which makes it one of the most unique places on the planet to be. And as frustrating as it is in moments like this, it really begs the question, do you have, and I asked this question I just asked this question of students at Howard University recently, do you love the country enough to make it stop what's happening right now?
So I'm laughing because you sound like a political scientist. And I would be happy to have that conversation about what it does to a democracy when you have a one-party state. And in fact, indeed, strong men always fall. You know, that's a given. They always fall, but they do a hell of a lot of damage.
They do. They
fall. And I have a harder time believing that the system was set up in such a way that we would have to go through these periods of, you know, a huge number of people losing their rights.
But how else do we deal with it, Heather? I mean, how long did we have slavery in this country before somebody said, hello? How long did Jim Crow exist before someone said, can we write a Voting Rights Act and a Civil Rights Act to make sure this crap doesn't happen? Of course we have these extended periods, but the ultimate check is us. We decided that was enough, whether it's the sexual revolution, whether it was even the effort that took 100+ years to get women the right to vote. I mean, even as you discussed earlier, even in the period when they were talking about freeing the Black man, they weren't talking about Black women.
No, I'm just laughing. How long are you planning to wait over there? Because you know, I like to see this before I turn up my toes. So I'm like, yeah, like a political scientist would be like, yes, of course, it's going to take however long. Right. But historians will be like, what about the people in the meantime? You know, there are literally women in Texas who aren't supposed to be on the roads if they're pregnant. You know, this is bonkers. So the question I think that is of interest right now, and I think maybe you're touching on it here, is how do you short circuit that system so we don't have to stay here and say, well, of course, it's all at the states. What do you think?
So I call this my moonstruck moment, where basically we need citizens and responsible elected officials to basically take to heart that scene where Cher slaps the crap out of her male lover, just snap out of it. That's the short-circuiting moment. That when people see it, it is somewhat akin to what we saw happen on October 7th. The reaction to what Hamas did to the innocents in Israel slapped the world in the face. And for the first time, there was this recognition, we've kind of like lulled ourselves into thinking that, okay, maybe a two-state solution, we'll work on that. The Palestinian people this, and they support Hamas really, but maybe not, I don't know. All of that stuff came crashing down in that moment when people are watching the raping and killing of women and babies, right? And so that's the moment that I think we are confronting right now, whether or not we want to have that, snap out of it moment with Trumpism and MAGA Republicanism. And it is as much inside the Republican Party as it is much outside the Republican Party as it is inside the Republican Party, because there are a hell of a lot of folks out there who aren't Republicans who are buying this crap. And so that becomes our real test, is how do we kind of move ourselves to snap everyone out of this lull that we find ourselves in, just sort of accepting these illiberal, anti-democratic behaviors as the new normal.
So I think women have been there ever since Dobbs, at least.
Yes.
But I'm wondering about, the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision of June 2022 that overturned Roe versus Wade, that recognized abortion as a constitutional right. But I'm wondering, one of the things that I've really noticed since the entire House Republican congressional delegation elected Mike Johnson of Louisiana to be the Speaker of the House, largely, it seems because they didn't actually know who he was.
Right.
If
they didn't.
I mean, how dumb? Well, I'm sorry. I have noticed a really different tone in the media about him. That is, people weren't willing to take on establishment figures like Kevin McCarthy of California, or even like Donald Trump, who has his own somewhat violent base,
right,
to make them nervous about calling him out. Johnson's got no protectors. And I thought it's really interesting how there's just been this pig pile on him. And I wonder if maybe that's our slap across the face moment, because he has been so articulate about attacking gay rights, abortion rights, the idea
deconstructing our rights. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to wrap a bow around all of this with this idea of how the culture wars have played an animating part in this democracy awakening. That is the title of the new book by author Heather Cox Richardson. We'll be back with more Heather right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the Michael Steele Podcast. We are having a great conversation. In fact, I went a little bit long in that first segment because I was just sitting there going, this is so good. She's hitting all the right chords with me. It is such a pleasure to welcome Heather Cox Richardson to the podcast. She's a professor of history at Boston College and an expert on American political and economic history. So, Heather, we kind of laid down a lot of historic and sort of contemporary tracks around the present day manifestation of republicanism and their distortion of conservatism. Certainly not cut out of the mold of Abraham Lincoln, who aptly defined it in his Cooper Union speech. But the next piece of this for me is what we find, and you talk about in the book, related to, this idea of rewriting American history, and even as much as starting with the Reagan Revolution, and Reagan was a political figure that I found very engaging and very alluring. I mean, he spoke in a way that made sense to me about a lot of things at the time, and certainly growing up in the era of Watergate and the sexual revolution, the Vietnam War, and he was like your dad who was saying it'll be okay, right? So you sort of had this sort of repositioning of a conservative / Republican narrative in the context of all of this. Reagan didn't scare people. He didn't threaten people. He didn't cuss them out. He didn't make them feel like they were somehow less. He, in fact, invited them to be a part of the American experience in many ways. And people will debate the up and down, the good and bad of that and the way he did it. But at least for a 17-year-old kid at the time, it made sense to me in 1976, what he was saying. But then you transition off of that sort of modern era in the first introduction of, for example, as you know, the abortion issue into the political space by Republicans putting it in their platform in 1980. Making it a plank of the party. You fast forward 12 years to Pat Buchanan's run for the presidency in 92, in which he talks about, quote, there's a culture war. My friends, this election is about more than who gets what. It is about who we are. It is about what we believe and what we stand for as Americans. There's a religious war going on in this country. This is 1992, people. What religious war is the man talking about, right? It is a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as was the Cold War itself. For this war is for the soul of America. How did that set the tone for what we now see 30 years later?
Well, I think you can hear it, but let's put that in context first, and then we can pull it forward. Sure. That's 92. What happens in 91? We get the dissolution of the USSR. So with the fall of the Soviet Union, there's a real rededication of resources on the part of that faction of the Republican Party, because it had been absorbed by the Republican Party at that point, to try and destroy that liberal consensus that had come out of World War II. The idea that the government had a role to play regulating business, providing a basic safety net, promoting infrastructure, and protecting civil rights. And Pat Buchanan is a really interesting character, because Buchanan had actually, he's 6 million years old, had been a speechwriter for Barry Goldwater.
Right.
It was Buchanan who, in fact, urged Richard Nixon to make abortion part of his messaging in 1972, the year before Roe versus Wade, which, of course, is written by a person who was appointed to the Supreme Court by a Republican under a Republican Chief Justice. So Pat Buchanan, quite deliberately in 1972, urged Nixon, we're in too many eras, urged Nixon to pick up Catholic Democrats over the abortion issue. And that's the injection of the abortion issue into modern day American politics. It's there in 72, before Roe versus Wade. Lots of people think it came after. It didn't. But what you see there, I think, is the deployment of all that culture war that had been amassed to fight the concept of communism, redirected at home at the people like Pat Buchanan called capital L liberals. And by that, they didn't just mean Democrats. They meant Democrats and the Republicans that they would shortly begin to call Republicans in name only.
Yep.
And they were the Eisenhower Republicans, who were the Teddy Roosevelt Republicans, who were the Lincoln Republicans. I've argued that that is the true basis of the Republican Party. And this was an extremist group that took over that party by deploying these attempts to use all these different tools against this great consensus in the United States. And that deployment of those issues enabled them to drive a wedge between people in that coalition. And also, I think people didn't fight back against it adequately because they believed that the guardrails were in place. One of the things we have discovered is that the things that we thought were in place are not in place.
Right.
And so a lot of people were like, oh, that's Pat Buchanan. We know he's out there. We know this one's never going to come to pass. And now, of course, we literally have a Speaker of the House who is a direct outgrowth of that concept that we are in a culture war that is part of a religious war, and that in order to return the nation to that perfect past that we never actually had, we have to follow those rules.
Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way, because I often, talk about these MAGA heads as wishing for an America that never really existed, and sort of hearkening back to the 1950s, which is right up in the alley of Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump, who grew up in that era, who were, teenage men, young white men of some means and certainly privilege in Donald Trump's case, who saw America through very different lenses than how most Americans were living life. And as I would point out to some of my friends, y'all talk about a time that you think was idyllic for white folks. It wasn't. Just talk to the white folks in Appalachia and in Mississippi, who still to this day are standing side by side with their Black, Hispanic brothers and sisters in poverty. So this idealized view of America has worked, I think, much more to its detriment. But then you have which I thought was a fascinating part of the book in chapter 18. And I highlighted this because I just thought it was so interesting when you talk about Bill Barr and how with Barr you got an effort to sort of hijack what the framers had talked about and said about this idea of self-government. Talk a little bit about that and how that furthers this narrative.
So that's a really interesting speech you're talking about, although that wasn't the only time people like him talked about it. And what they are arguing is that the concept of treating everybody equally before the law ultimately degrades democracy because it is morally, in their minds, bankrupt. That is, if you start to treat LGBTQ plus people as equal to everybody else, you've introduced immorality into the country. So how do you...
Can I pause right there? Despite the immorality of those so-called Christian men who the latest scandals I've seen had them, trying to get with young children and cheating on their wives. So those moralities, I guess, are okay. So LGBTQ morality somehow breaks the country apart.
Well, we need to. I'll get back to that, but there's an important distinction there, and that is that the kinds of morality that what I'm talking about support is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Some people should have dominance over others, and the kind of abuses you're talking about are abuses of dominance. And that's something that is much more acceptable on the part of Christian conservatives, for example, because they see the world as a patriarchy. But in the Barr speech, and as many people who encourage Christian nationalism think, or at least how they articulate their beliefs, they say that this idea of treating everybody equally destroys democracy. And so what that speech said was that when the framers talked about self-governance, they were not talking about voting rights. What they were talking about was an individual's ability to govern oneself. And in order to do that, because humanity is naturally sinful, they need strong religion to do that. So what Barr did in that speech, what I found chilling when I read it, because I read it the night he gave it, and I was shocked how few people reacted to it. His logical outcome there was that the framers of the Constitution and the founders, who had very deliberately created a nation that was not based in religion, in his mind had deliberately created a nation based in religion, with the sense that one cannot govern oneself without religion. And therefore, this idea of self-government was not about creating a world in which everybody is equal before the law and has a right to a say in their government, but was rather about creating Christian nationalism. And that is just so far out there, it makes your head spin.
Well,
you can hear James Madison spinning in his grave even now.
Absolutely. He said, and even to go further back than James Madison, he sounds like the very, Pharisees and Sadducees that Jesus himself spoke against, because of how they would try to frame the culture and the rights of individuals in every little thing they did. There's this religious overlord, and last time I checked, he was here to kind of break that puzzle up a little bit. But it's very telling to me in that speech how much he was giving sort of the legal bona fides, the constitutional bona fides for this very illiberal, very anti-constitutional notion of religion sort of dominating our lives. And we've seen it and heard it from the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, and Lauren Boebert, who've declared, we are, this Christian nation, and, we should all believe and behave a certain way. I'm like, well, what are you going to do with all the people who aren't Christian? What are you going to do with all the people who don't believe?
Well, and you can see why they are fellow travelers with Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, where the CPAC has frequently been there for their meetings, right, or had come as a speaker, and why they're fellow travelers with Vladimir Putin's Russia. This idea that you're going to go after LGBTQ people as a start, And then, pretty soon you're going to go after women's rights. You're going to reinstate a traditional patriarchy. That's the exact language that you're seeing, especially out of Orban, but that Putin certainly has given at least lip service to and has made a reality to the degree that he's working actively with church figures. And that, that bigger picture, the idea that there is in fact sort of a global march toward authoritarianism riding on the back of patriarchy and an attack on the idea of democracy, is one that people like President Joe Biden have articulated, and Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, have articulated again and again and again. And that's, I think, the level at which we need to be looking in this moment. It's not really about whether your taxes are X or Y, and it's not really about whether you get your broadband, or it's not
Right.
really about, it's about, are we going to have a democracy? Because what I always say to people on the right and on the left who say that democracy has failed and they want to try something else is, you're probably not getting your way right now under democracy, but tell me how much better you think it's going to be under an authoritarian. And
Right.
when you're talking about that, talk to the people in Russia who probably thought Putin wasn't so bad when when they seem to have at least some jobs and at least some access to things like McDonald's,
Right.
But about now, when they've lost their livelihoods and they are being thrown in the front lines as cannon fodder, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Nothing.
And if you think that's a better world than the one we've got, more power to you, but I don't want to live in it.
So how that sort of begs up the question then about Joe Biden and his presidency. And in a particular way, as we've seen in the last 6 or so weeks, and specifically from his speech on Israel about a week ago, how has his presidency played a role in this fight on behalf of democracy? Do you think people are taking it seriously enough, or is this something that historians like yourself 100 years from now are going to be saying, damn, they missed it?
Both. I think both. I mean, one of the things that surprises me is, somebody from the press called me once and said, you're always talking about democracy, but why doesn't anybody in the administration ever talk about it? And my jaw hit the floor. And I said, they're talking about it every single day.
Right.
And it's not being covered. And I don't know what else they can do, because, they send out news flashes and they're constantly talking about it, and it's not getting the kind of coverage that one would think a major speech by a president would. But I think that the Biden presidency has been transformational in that, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, all the laws that passed in those first 2 years that have, kept the economy roaring, that have created all these new jobs, that have brought back manufacturing, that are fixing infrastructure, including on a bipartisan basis. These are transformational laws trying to reinvest in ordinary Americans rather than simply doing tax cuts that go to the top of the economic ladder, which has never produced the kind of economic growth, right, or kind of even the anything that it has promised to produce. But on the international level, the fact that Biden and Blinken held together NATO and supported NATO, and then reached out to allies and partners around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific, really dramatically in the Indo-Pacific, and also in Africa. I mean, Vice President Kamala Harris's trip to Africa was a really big deal that got almost no press coverage. When I think about what would have happened if Donald Trump, who had promised to destroy NATO in his second term, and who obviously was very close to Vladimir Putin, had been in power in February 2022, when Russia invaded those 4 oblasts of Ukraine, which they had been talking about since 2016. Those in the testimony about the Russia investigation, they talk about getting those 4 oblasts, and that was part of the deal with helping Donald Trump. If he had been in power and if he had simply let it happen, Ukraine certainly would have fought, but it would not have been able to continue the fight very much longer, as it hadn't after 2014. So think about that. Right before that, China and Russia, our 2 largest geopolitical foes, had made a really close alliance that now China is backing away from, because Russia is circling the drain economically, among other things. So those two countries had made this deal. Russia at that point would have had all those fabulous ports in Ukraine and
Yep.
all that additional incredibly valuable land that makes up the breadbasket of the world. Now, those two areas are much closer. They're much more powerful. So now you've got Belarus, for example. You've got all the areas around Russia and the growing power of China, because you're not going to have Biden and his administration really investing in the Indo-Pacific and making people aware of things like the fact that China had been spying on them. That's why the
Right.
balloon big deal. That was more about the fact the US knew it was going on, but the countries around China didn't realize that China was doing that to them. That region is all closer. At the same time that all the NATO countries are balkanized, they're not able to work together, and the United States is cheering on Russia and China. Where would we be today? For the case. And I don't believe you and I would be sitting here saying, yeah, democracy looks like it's really kind of making a stand here.
Right.
I think we would have been sitting here going, oh my God, do you have a place to go?
Yeah.
So when you think about Biden, it's funny. I'm really an observer. I feel like I'm kind of the spider in the corner of the window watching what's going on and weaving stories about it. But I actually said to someone the other day, I said, what more could Biden be doing? The world is burning and people are just constantly, you're not doing this, you're not doing this, you're not doing
Right.
this. Okay, I'm doing, and I finally said, I feel like we ought to help him out.
Right.
Because,
Can you help a brother out?
Yeah, and instead of complaining all the time, sort of saying to the media or writing our own media that says, hey, we've got all these new jobs. Do you have one? What's it like to have it? How about your town that got one of these new plants? So I actually put on my Facebook page, has anybody gotten one of these jobs and what's it's like? You should see it. People are like, oh yeah, they're hiring in my town. And it's like, I haven't seen these stories.
Well, see, there's so much that goes into how, just from I don't want to get you caught up in politics because I respect your role as a historian, but it does really speak to how the politics of the moment are informing and dictating the national narrative around things that are so much more important than the politics. And it's just frustrating when I hear people whining, and I put it this way, whining and moaning and bitching about something. And then, like you just said, when you say, well, okay, so what's happening in your neighborhood? How's your business doing? You went on vacation last year, but you were complaining about gas prices. So clearly the gas prices weren't so high that kept you from going on vacation last year. And when you have that sort of crystallizing moment, you realize just how frustrating it is to listen to people complain. And this is the strength of the negative narrative. It is easier even though things are going well for me, I guilt you into feeling good about how well things are going for you by saying how bad it is for everybody else, when in fact it ain't that bad for everybody else, right? That is not to say that there aren't people who've slipped through cracks, that are having difficult times, who've lost a job, can't afford prices. Not saying that. But I think in the main and the whole, as you just noted from your Facebook posts, just randomly asking people, okay, so I hear there were jobs programs. I hear that there was an infrastructure project. Is any of this happening in your neighborhood? And everybody's like, yeah, over here. Oh, yeah, over there. What does it say to you as we wrap up our conversation? And this is really gets to I think the heart of your book, about democracy awakening. What does it say to you about us first waking up and recognizing that we're actually kind of part of the problem? And that we're actually kind of the stick in the mud here. We may be a little bit, tad, okay, a lot selfish. That we are very much self-centered around the me. And you've got this megalomaniac who's reminding you, just it's all about me, it's all about you, and I'm your retribution. And you're looking for someone to do something for you that, keeping, in my view, in the true spirit of Lincoln, that you're probably better poised to do for yourself. And Lincoln, and I'll give you the last word on this as we close out. In your book, you note at the end here, I want to pull it up real quick because it's just sort of summarized for me a lot. You say, quote, Lincoln emphasized that those trying to destroy democracy in his era were not the conservatives they claimed to be, but were dangerous radicals whose version of America must be rejected. He called on his neighbors to defend equality before the law and the right of everyone to consent to the government under which they live. They must reclaim the history of America so that it would have a new birth of freedom. That's this moment. That's this moment where today, 2023, all of us in the democracy space are calling on our fellow neighbors, our family members. How many of us don't want to go to Thanksgiving dinner because grandma just batshit crazy over Trump, right? We're asking them to defend equality before the law and the right of everyone to consent to the government under which they live. We're trying to point out that you are being led not by men of principle, but dangerous radicals whose version of America must be rejected. Professor, I give it to you.
Well, obviously, I agree with that. I do think that in terms of, I want to go back for a second, though, and in terms of people saying negative things about the country, I actually think there's more to it than selfishness. And that is, since the Vietnam War and Watergate, it has been far easier to talk about things that are wrong in the government than things that are right.
Yes.
That is, you didn't want to have your heart on your sleeve and say, yeah, I really like that the president is doing this or that the government is doing this, because you expected that you would be disappointed. And I think one of the reasons that people are starting to pay attention to democracy is people starting to say, wait a minute, I really like that the government is protecting this right, or I really like that the government is initiating this policy that is doing so much good for so many people. So that's one way in which I think things are changing and need to change. And it's not a question of people being selfish. It's more a question of we have become accustomed to expecting the government not to work for us. And increasingly since Biden got into office, he's been trying to demonstrate that government can, in fact, work for the people. But in the larger scheme, I think that that's really the message of the book, but also of this moment and of American history. And that is that our country has done the best, and it has expanded democracy when ordinary Americans step up to the plate and say, this is what I believe in. I believe that we should be equal before the law, and I believe that we have the right to have our votes counted. And when we do that, and when we protect each other's rights to do that, we elevate people like Abraham Lincoln or other politicians who do our bidding. And that maybe goes back to your argument about the idea that we need to have popular pressure to do things like overcome the gerrymandering in North Carolina and in other states. And when we do that, when we recognize that our very democracy and the rights that are inherent in that are at stake, and we join together to push back against that small group of people trying to dominate us, when we do that, we are not only successful, we redefine American democracy yet again to include more people. And when we do that, we all do better. And, one of the reasons it's called Democracy Awakening is that you see this everywhere around us now, not only in the union movements, but also in the women's movements in favor of abortion rights since the Dobbs decision. You see it in the Black Lives Matter movement. You see it in all sorts of movements where people are saying, hey, wait a minute, that democracy really could work for me, and here's what I would like it to do. So it's a really frightening time for a lot of people where we are right now. But one of the things that jumps out to me about how many ways in which our era is like the late 1890s and the 1850s is the joy of creation, that this is a moment when we get to decide what our future looks like. And there are a lot of people who want us to choose a future that is dominated by evangelical Christians who tell the rest of us how to live. But there are a really small proportion of our polity compared to the vast majority of us who like the idea that we all get to determine our own future. And at the end of the day, that's really what being a human is all about. And I don't think Americans will turn away from it.
Wow. I guess I can get up off the couch now. Thank you very much, Professor Heather Cox Richardson, for this very informative, enlightening, engaging conversation around our democracy and its awakening. The book is Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America. Check out her widely read Substack newsletter, Letters from an American, and that you can follow and read more of the work of this very, very intelligent and engaging professor, which is hard to say about a lot of professors, but you made learning easy. I appreciate it very, very much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. And you can follow the good professor on Twitter at HC_Richardson. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Michael Steele, and certainly on any other platform out there. I'm trying to get on everybody because Twitter is getting a little bit crazy, but we'll have that conversation later, Professor, because that contributes to some of the silliness we see going on today. But until next time, folks, be safe, be well out there. Don't forget to do that thing I love the most. That's the download. You know how to do that. Until next time, be safe. Fall is here, baby. It's getting chilly where I am. I don't know about you, but it's real chilly. It's getting real chilly. And so that means it's going to be sweater weather. And I'm looking forward to that. Until next time, wrap up and warm up.